Part of the story I'm trying to tell in this book is about the way in which the shades of our skin, the hues in our complexions are one clue, one artifact, one inheritance of that violence. And that's partly how I understand my own skin today.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske, and Rudy Salu is on holiday, but don't you worry, we have returning guest host, political guru for the pod, housing advocate, Konstantin Hatcher. Konstantin, how goes it?
It goes well. I mean, political guru, that sounds really important. I like it. Maybe I should get cards made up and just, hi, my name is Konstantin, the political guru.
For Good is in the Details.
For Good is in the Details. I guess I have to be specific. Yes, thanks for having me on.
Let everyone know what your new thing is.
My new thing, yes. I am Senior Director of Community Engagement for the Office of Mayor Karen Bass. And to be clear, the opinions expressed on this show are my own and not in connection or in any way related to the mayor's office. I have to get that disclaimer.
Well, everyone, we have got a great episode for you. I love history, but historians also really intrigue me because I just think about the work of isolating an idea and doing all the record search in order to put together the information for us to understand history. So today we have historian, legal scholar, Dr. Martha Jones, and we are talking about her book, The Trouble of Color. And it's her historical work. She turns it on understanding her own family's lineage. In understanding that, it brings us to a lot of questions about, the history of the United States, the context, and what is race in America, what is blackness in America. Okay, so Konstantin, what did you like about this episode? Because remember, in prepping for this, when I was reading her book, I basically ignored everything and everyone because I wanted to read the book because I liked it so much. And then you got your hands on the book.
Yeah.
And then you ignored everything.
Yes, basically Dr. Dolske ruined our whole vacation because she was engrossed in this book as opposed to enjoying
margaritas in the pool.
Sort of enjoying margaritas in the pool. However, once I got a hold of the book, I completely understood. I forgave her because this book is outstanding. Coming to this conversation as an African American, it just really takes you through that journey of our experience from enslavement all the way through current and through the civil rights movement and all the different layers and complicated stories and just existence, balancing that proudness of being Black, yet you're at the overcoming such a tremendous barriers, and even within our community, that tension between proximity to white and what allowances that gives you. And it really takes you this difficult history, but in a beautiful way and a way that you can connect to. And it really makes you really want to look at your own family and try to dig up your own history and understand what your great-greats and great-great-greats and your ancestors, their experiences, and helps you to understand kind of a little bit more of what they were going through and what's led us to the point that we are now. So it's just a tremendous book.
And it's vulnerable, and
So
she gives
vulnerable.
her family a lot of grace too. We were
Yes.
talking about that. I think what stood out to me was at the beginning of her book, so this is what totally got a hold on me, is that she's describing being in a Black Studies class, and she's confronted by a student saying, I think it was something along the lines of like, who do you think you are? Essentially because she does not look Black. That prompts this turn to do this historical analysis of her family because she is in fact Black, but when we trace back the roots, it has to do with enslavement and the women in her family. Kind of this stunning look at, she is being told, who do you think you are, as though she's not Black, but the reason, the whole backstory of it is just stunning. But it's not something we really talk about when we talk about the American Civil War. We talk about enslavement. I think a lot focuses on men more than it does on women.
Right.
This was a way to talk about the strength of the women who went through that, and also
Survived.
to give that complicated understanding of what colorism means and what does it mean to be Black in America. So she was a great guest, really insightful.
And that juxtaposition between the reason why her Blackness is questioned is because of the extraordinarily Black experience of being enslaved.
Yeah. Listeners, just before we get started, I wanted to let you know that there is a guidebook featuring 5 episodes and discussion questions that can be used amongst the philosophy curious, fans of the shows, or for educators who want to incorporate the podcast into their syllabi. It's Philosophy Unplugged. It's on Amazon and on our Patreon. I will link that in the show notes. Okay, without further ado, we're going to talk some history with Professor Martha Jones. Martha Jones, welcome to Good is in the Details. Can you tell me a bit about your background in history that then led you to this academic work that's also your memoir?
First of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. Where I might start that story is to say I came to history somewhat late in my work life. I had a first vocation as a lawyer, but family history in particular was always one of my passions, even back then. And I went on to do a graduate degree so that I could be a historian full time, but not quite a historian of family. So I'm a historian of Black America with an emphasis on the history of law and politics and culture. I might have stayed there, except that there was always a way in which my first passion, which had been family history, was running underneath the work that I do. So here we are, finally talking about that after having worked on 4 books before this.
Well, can I ask you, what area of law did you do? And then you said, okay, wait, I want to do history.
Yeah, I was what we call public interest lawyer in New York City. This is going back a ways into the 1980s and 1990s. I worked in a not-for-profit community-based law office for a time on a project representing people with mental illness in the wake of the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals in New York State. And then by the end of the 80s, working on what was then a still new and misunderstood scourge, what today we know of as HIV and AIDS. So my clients were women and their families living with HIV and AIDS in those earlier years of that pandemic. So I was a civil litigator in some ways. I did many kinds of legal work, but my work was always in service to particular communities. And partly I come to study history because law practice and the logics of law don't always rarely invite us to really understand sort of the deep backstory of some of what we are confronting in our own time. So I had a sabbatical for a year that let me study history to try and understand better some of the deep roots of the things I was encountering in my community and in the courtroom. And I got hooked on historical research and never went back, as we say, never looked back, and have been working on history ever since.
So I know a lot of people who will study history, or, I'm in philosophy, they'll study these things and then they go into law. And I'm always interested in how that background informs their legal trajectory. But for you, it's different. So I'm wondering, how did studying law inform your history trajectory?
That's a great question. I think that early on, I think some people regarded it as a handicap, which is to say that as a lawyer, we argue and construct arguments by very rigid rules. We don't entertain always a lot of nuanced or contingent thinking. We are arguing in a way that is intended to win a result for a client. And this is in tension with the ways in which historians, as I came to learn, are, yes, interested in the facts and what happened, but also are part of an inquiry that is about interpretation, that is about the contingencies of archives and theory and more. So I had to learn how to let go of or get some distance on my very rigid way of thinking about problems as a lawyer, try to develop some of the nuanced kind of reasoning that is more compatible with the complicated and oftentimes never quite neatly resolved questions that historians try and speak to.
Was there a particular pivot point that made you kind of say, okay, no, this is the thing I want to do? Or was it more of a gradual thing? I know for me, I was in a sales career before, and I was doing volunteering with the Obama campaign, and they asked me to come on staff, and I had actually turned it down because I didn't want to take a pay cut. And I instantly regretted it, and I decided in that moment, like, if this opportunity comes around again, I'm jumping in with 2 feet. Did you have a moment, and I never look back, and here I am, now I get to work, I'm currently working with Mayor Bass, but is there a moment that, like, that light bulb just came on? It's like, wait, this is what I need to do. This is my calling.
Yeah. On that sabbatical year, I took a graduate seminar, not in history, in fact, in the English department. It was a course on early African American literature. I was working on a short paper. I was giving it my all. I was spread out on my living room floor. You know how it is. I've got the books open and the drafts spread out and trying to think through what I want to say. And when I look up, it's 3:00 in the morning. I thought, oh, I've gone down the rabbit hole, right? Not only on this paper, but that I had really discovered another kind of passion and something else that could keep me up into the wee hours of the morning because I was so absorbed. So for me, that told me that I had not only the desire, but the kind of drive that I think you need to do many kinds of work, including to be a researcher and a writer. And so I probably never looked back. I had an advisor in those years who said to me, well, I'll support you coming back to school and doing a graduate degree in history late in life, though it is, if you promise me you'll never complain to me when you're miserable. When I think about that now, it makes me smile because I never was miserable. That's the important thing to say, that I really didn't look back. And in that way, I think, Konstantin, in part, that might have been part by design, but that was also good fortune, right? I had great teachers, was really able to indulge and then hone a new set of skills that still spoke to questions of social justice, the kinds of questions that had driven my legal work. But now I was answering those questions by a new set of methodologies and writing with a new kind of voice. And that was exciting to me to discover there was a continuity between that first chapter and the next chapter.
I'm just going to be a bit of a fangirl here. When I was reading your book, the opening chapter, I got emotional. I got really emotional as I was reading it, and I am not entirely sure why. Maybe it's partly because I've been the professor in a classroom setting. Maybe it's because as a woman studying philosophy, there's very few of us, and this moment of you in the classroom, it's Black studies, right? And you are talking about the thinker Fanon, and you are questioned about your legitimacy to be there. And I don't know why, but it just really rocked me. And then to go through the story, the women in your family who were enslaved and part of, part of this story of women enslaved and then having children by the master or whatever, and that is your lineage and your history. I just can't help but wonder, have you ever confronted that student who questioned your legitimacy to be studying Black studies, to have any authority on it, given the fact that the trajectory of your history is one that encapsulates like the horrors, the terrors, the crimes of the American South and enslavement?
You're right and thank you for that, really insightful reflection on that opening scene. I was challenged. I was nearly opposed in that moment, which is to say I had a classmate who thought I didn't belong, who took a look at me and perhaps thought he knew what he saw or was baffled by what he saw, but he was sure that I didn't belong in a Black studies class. I wasn't worthy of speaking about Frantz Fanon, great Black intellectual. I guess the thing to say about that moment, there are two things. One is he and I become friends in the months that follow because I'm a persistent person, even as a young person. And I might have been shaken, and I certainly was, but I wasn't going anywhere. And so I hang around and we develop a friendship on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's a long time ago now, and I haven't been able to reconnect with him, even as I've thought so much about him in writing this book. There are other characters in that scene, including a young woman who was my resident assistant, who was in the room. I don't know what she thinks. I suspect, and this is part of the challenge and the trick of memory, is for me, that is a moment that is seared into my psyche. It will never leave me, I hope, because it is that formative a moment. But I think for other people in the room, it was just another day in the classroom. And I'm not sure, that it stands out in the same way for them. And that's part of what's fascinating about revisiting your own past, whether it's with classmates or friends or with family. We all may have been in the same room, but we don't remember what happened on a given day or in a given moment in precisely the same way. So I stand by the way I remember it, but I also appreciate that for other folks, there might be a different recollection or no recollection at all. And I think that's fascinating to me.
I love that point because it's this telling of this rich tapestry of your history, of your family history. You're telling this story that has so much meaning and just this kind of like intense experience and really highlighting and showing like by telling your story, you're telling the story of Africa, of our American journey. And I see that theme kind of carried through the book in terms of like the perspective of like even the kind of that similar thing as when you talked about your father and his relationships at I believe Herman, where they were so impactful for him, but it didn't seem like they were necessarily reciprocal. I love how you weave that through the story as well in terms of, often that kind of our perception as we go through things, it could be something that's so traumatic or so important, yet the other participant, it's just like another day. They may not even remember.
Yeah. Have you had other people come forward and respond that people who have a similar, there's several Americans who have a similar history to you, right? But maybe their story isn't being told or it's not talked about, because one of the reasons why I loved your book so much is because a lot of times in American history, when the American Civil War is talked about or slavery, we might have some images of people out in fields, maybe some images of, let's say, a scarred back from a beating. A lot of it is of men, and there is not much conversation around what happened to the women, how women were essentially sex trafficked. These are women who, loved their families or were afraid or maybe even on some level connected with the community or some of their white counterparts. That does not get told as much. And so I'm just wondering, how has the response been if other people come forward and said, yes, this is my family lineage too?
Yes. It's really powerful to, as I have been in these weeks, to be in libraries, to be in bookstores, to share some of this story, the story that I tell in The Trouble of Color, and to have people, in a sense, reciprocate, right, by telling parts of their own family stories. I've begun to realize that part of what is shaping those conversations is that many of us are the beneficiaries of what I think of as the moment of Roots. Roots was a television miniseries, and before that, a book that told an epic tale of a African and then African American family across many generations. It was for many Black Americans the first time that we saw our stories told on the big screen, which in those days was television. We tuned in real time. I think it's 8 nights that millions of Americans sit in front of their televisions and begin to learn this story. It is important, to your point, to remember that Roots is told from the perspective of a young man, a captive, who later grows, and his subsequent families. And there are women in that story. But I think that my work really benefits from what are now 3 generations of Black women's historians who have been very deliberate about recovering that past. I don't think I could have understood and had deep insight into the women in my family who, as you said, are exploited sexually, who bear children and make families as enslaved women and then as freed women. I couldn't have done that if I didn't have the companionship of an enslaved woman herself, a woman named Harriet Jacobs, who in 1861 publishes her narrative or memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And Jacobs explains to us what it's like to be 14, right? Beginning to come into young womanhood and to have a slaveholder become predator. So she's an example, right, of the kind of guides that we have when we encounter those stories in our own families. And her story really helped me understand the women in my family better.
And it's so important to understand today. Like, I was thinking about that moment of you in the classroom and how the context of your family lineage just brings so much more to what that moment was, like how important the historical references to understanding today. And I think about that also in terms of the hypersexualization of Black women and also women of color, and how historically the laws when it came to assault or sexual assault were radically different if the victim was a Black woman. And you can take a look at this history, and something that struck me, I believe it was a section we were talking about in Kentucky, that the people in Kentucky noticed, right, that the population was definitely shifting. So it seems like everybody knows that this is
Yeah.
happening. Why isn't it more part of the history? Like when we're talking about the American Civil War, when we're talking about slavery, why are all of the images of the people working in the fields and we don't have this part of the story, but everybody knows? What in your mind is going on there? Why does nobody want to talk about the fact that we have so many Americans who are descendants of enslaved women and the master of the house?
Yeah, I think that, the part of the story I'm trying to tell in this book is about the way in which the shades of our skin, the hues in our complexions are one clue, one artifact, one inheritance of that violence. And that's partly how I understand my own skin today. Why don't we know that more forthrightly? Why don't we know that as well as we know other parts of slavery's inhumanity? I think in part for the descendants of those women themselves, there is a combination of shame on the one hand, that sexual violence, the legacies of sexual violence carry their own kinds of shame with them on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's, I think, perceived as a way of protecting those women and bestowing on them a kind of dignity that is long overdue. And so we respected their silence and the silence that surrounded their early lives, the silence that surrounded who had fathered their children, I think for a long time as a way of honoring them. So part of what I was interested in this book is appreciating the ways in which in each generation, it turns out we're able to tell new stories, different parts of the stories. I can write today in the 21st century and say forthrightly, the only shame, right, in those encounters and in that violence is the shame that is rightly on the shoulders of enslavers, right, who exploit women. But I don't think that kind of analysis, if I could put it that way, has always been available. We have lived through many things, including Me Too, right, which taught us something about on whose shoulders, right, the blame sits. But that has been a learning experience for us as a culture. Perhaps we still carry some reticence about naming our foremothers and explaining our foremothers and ourselves as in part, as lives that are intertwined with sexual violence. I think that's still a hard story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I really love about the book is the way that you kind of tell also the story of our complicated history with our color and colorism within our community.
Mm-hmm.
And just thinking and just in terms of how it changes from context to context. And it really kind of brought up things for me, thinking about when I was a youngster and my first school, me and my brother were the only two Black kids in the school. In that context, my Blackness, I was as Black as I might as well have been as dark as night, right? In terms of my color, in
Mm-hmm.
that context, because I was Black, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the next school I ended up in is an all Black school. And now all of a sudden, my Blackness is now questioned, right? I don't have that vernacular. So there was there's some elements in the story and parts of that story where you really trace that throughout the history of your family. What were some of the things that stood out to you, or that you even gradually came to terms with as you're writing this story and going through and diving into your family history and going through the layers and layers and layers, what things did that bring up for you?
Sure. I so appreciate your point that when it comes to Blackness, context matters a whole lot for how we may understand ourselves, but certainly for how others might read our bodies and what they mean. And in this story, one of the characters that I'm most reluctant to spend time with is a great grandmother, my grandmother's mother, Fanny, who I know from the stories that have been passed down was not only a woman who could pass, as we say, but was a woman who, when it suited her in downtown St. Louis, where she lived, when it suited her, she tricked the eye of ticket takers at the movie theater or ushers, clerks in the department store. She used her body strategically, her light color strategically. And this, to my 21st century sensibilities, is really a kind of betrayal that's almost unforgivable. But as I spend more time with her and I learn more about her, I understand that, first of all, she's not alone in St. Louis when she passes in these kinds of ways, but that she, like many Black Americans who could, believed that when they passed, they were thwarting or challenging or undermining Jim Crow. They really saw it as one part pleasure and one part politics always. And that was a revelation for me, frankly, to see it from her point of view and not merely from my point of view. But it's complicated. And in Fanny's life, it's complicated because she has children, including my own grandmother, who cannot pass. That means that her oldest daughter, cannot go with her downtown when she wants to go to the whites only theater or she wants to try on clothes in a downtown department store. And so we have not only Fanny, who is sort of butting up against Jim Crow, that's one set of tensions, but you also have the tensions within her family because she is, as the story comes down to me, she wounds her daughter in a way that her daughter never forgets, that even as it was somewhat frivolous and even if it was just episodic, there were these hurtful moments in which her mother, in a sense, leaves her behind in order to indulge in her light skin. That's hard on all fronts, right? That's a difficult story to tell. It's a difficult story to live, I think, on all fronts, wherever you're situated in that story.
Absolutely.
I have so many thoughts. Right now in the humanities, there seems to be a bit of a cultural crisis. Not within the humanities itself, but like on the outside, just kind of pushing back on the relevance of it, or that maybe some discussions about history or other branches of the social sciences is attacking the greatness of America. And so I want to know, what would be your response to that from a historian's point of view? What good does telling these stories about not only your personal history, but it's a reflection of American history? What good does that bring us to now? What is the relevance? What is it helpful for? And yeah, I guess because, sometimes I hear people say that when we talk about these things that we're somehow diminishing America or something, or we're just looking at bad things. But what is your point of view of the significance of tracing this history for our lives now?
I think it continues to be, as it always has been, important for all Americans to see themselves in our national story. That means that many stories are going to surface and be woven into our narrative that recount some of the darkest chapters in our past. If part of what we want to engender in folks is a kind of patriotism and a deep identification with the nation, folks have to see themselves in the stories that we tell ourselves as a nation. If you erase me from that narrative, you compromise my ability to really latch onto and understand myself to be as essential as any American to our national present. I think that's one thing. When we suppress those stories, we invite folks to see us as, I think, cowards. There's a cowardice in suppressing stories or erasing stories or retiring stories that are part of the American past. past. I'm somebody who believes that as a nation collectively, we're much stronger than that. And we have an extraordinary capacity to know and to grapple with and to live with the difficult past and to still be a country, to still be a nation. So I don't know why we would present ourselves as so fragile that we can't accommodate those stories. And then finally, I think that even in the most kind of baldly, or maybe particularly in the most baldly sort of patriotic calls for incorporating history into our sense of ourselves, we're always looking for heroes. And to me, to reach back to the beginning of our conversation, those women who endured the degradations and the violent slavery,
Yes.
and went on to not only wage the battle against slavery, but then to continue as freed people, to make families, to make communities, to build institutions. These are American heroes if we choose to embrace them. I'm always wondering why. I understand that we have a history of segregation. I'm fascinated. I think that our imaginations are so segregated today that some white Americans can't imagine that Black Americans could be their heroes, right? Among their heroes, among the figures whom they admire. We have some of that. The great Frederick Douglass is an example of someone who I think, has risen or surfaced and become part of American memory, perhaps like Dr. King. There are a small number, but even in the family stories that I tell, I see heroes, right? I see figures to be admired who teach us so much about not only where we've been, but what we're made of and what is possible for us, even in and through very, very difficult times. We miss those heroes if we are unwilling to also recall what made them heroic, which are some very difficult chapters in our past.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. The women were extraordinary, and that's part of the story. It's not something to push to the side. And being in Southern California, we have people from all over the world, and my friends, and now as an adult, my students, they are of different backgrounds. Their parents are different areas of the world, and to some people will walk around this world with the expression of one genetic component, really, and the other part of their ethnicity is not obvious in their body and in their appearance. There is this confusion of if you're not this enough, or there's some pain because they might be passing as one, and then they'll be in that group and somebody will tell a joke, not knowing that they are of that ethnicity that is of the joke. So I think that there's so much here for several Americans who are, have a history that is not necessarily expressed in their body. And then the way that the world responds to them can be painful, can be confusing, and then they're also trying to figure out where they fit. I know that your work is in Black studies, but have you seen any parallels with people of other backgrounds, other Americans resonating with your story?
Yes, and that is part of what's been remarkable is meeting, for example, a Jewish American who says to you, my mother is a Sephardic Jew from the Middle East. My father was an Ashkenazi Jew from Eastern Europe. And in that family, that cultural distance was important and troubling and really shaped who their children have turned out to be. I meet the woman who is, inherits the line of the daughters of the American Revolution on the one hand, and is married to someone who is just two generations from immigration to the United States from a wholly other part of the world. I grew up, I think, unfortunately, thinking that my kind of family, with all of its ambiguities, with all of its crossed lines, was aberrant. And what people are teaching me is that that is the American story. And that is what the American family is, whether you're crossing lines of faith or of culture, of color, of national origin, that we are a nation of precisely these kinds of families. It's been incredibly moving to listen to folks who don't share my particular version of that story, share the ways in which they too have struggled with what it means to be unable to check one box, right? and instead embrace a much more complicated human experience. But I think that really is the American story.
And it is that box checking that you're talking about. We've organized ourselves culturally politically, economically, in terms of these racial features. There's just been this comfort, I guess, of then when you see somebody to automatically assume based on their body who they are, what they like. I think that this story is highlighting the confusion that people are, or actually highlighting the fact that people are in boxes, that we talk about individualism. We got out of the American Revolution this idea that you can be an individual and chart your own path. And so we have that one idea of being American. But on the other hand, we have this cultural, legal, and economic history that says, no, you look this way, therefore you are this type of person. And your work is showing that kind of collision that is cultural, this confusion to look at somebody and say, wait a minute, I thought you were this, but you're not really this. And they want to go back to the box that they're used to checking in order to figure out another person. Did that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if you are in a room, as I have been, and I've never done this, but maybe I should try. And you ask, how many people in this room have heard some version of the question directed at them, what are you? And the hands will go up, right? Because for many kinds of reasons, we don't comport with the boxes, whether it's, in my story, it's the complexion, the color of your skin, but it might be your habit of dress. It might be, the accent that you bring to the English language or the language you speak that is not English at all. It might be how you worship, on and on. Americans know that question, what are you? My way of answering that question, which I never felt you could really answer in like a quip or, in an elevator or at a cocktail party, right? Like, who are you? Who am I? My version of the answer is to try and tell a long family story, which is a way of explaining how I understand myself, but is also a way of trying to help other people understand who I am to myself, but who I am to them also. So I think that there are many, many, many Americans who will tell you that they get that question, what are you? Or the more pointed, who do you think you are? It is a testament to just what you suggest, that we expect to be able to use a kind of common sense to put people in boxes. And when our common sense defies us or is muddled in some way, we might be tempted to ask what I think is, in my view, not the most polite question you might ask of someone you don't really know, but nonetheless, the question, what are you?
You have these amazing heroes and heroines woven through your story that are portrayed in such an authentic way. They're part of what makes them so, you get so drawn into these characters, which are your actual family members, is just the imperfection. Because they live in an imperfect world and dealing with like extraordinary obstacles. Just in the sense that, our community is we have that sense of, hey, we don't keep what happens in the house, right? We don't share family business outside the house. What gave you that courage and confidence to be able to say, hey, I'm going to put my family, it's one thing when you're telling like someone else's history, but it's your own personal and your family's history. That courage to say, hey, I want to tell this rich history of my family and put it all out there, even the things that aren't necessarily flattering. What gave you that courage or confidence to really to step out and do that? Because I can't imagine that was an easy thing to do.
No, it's true. I was raised too in the way you describe, which is you don't air dirty laundry or whatever the metaphor, choose your metaphor.
Right. In so many different ways.
So I was raised that way too. But I think for me, on the one hand, don't we have enough books written by so-called light-skinned Black folks that celebrate us, and imagine us to be without flaws. And I didn't think we needed another book that was full of that kind of self-serving kind of take on a family, frankly. And at the same time, I think what comes with keeping family secrets is shame, right? I think it's very hard to do that without, being contaminated by the element of shame. And so I thought it was important for me personally, if I was going to tell a family story, to do it without shame and without judgment, largely on my forebears, that I could tell their stories with their flaws, with their warts. I could still love them and care for them on the page. And that's a journey that's partly personal, but it's also a writer's journey in learning how to tell stories that can contain those two seemingly competing impulses, right? Sort of showing the flaws on the one hand and loving people even as they are flawed and they are very human. So that's my goal as a memoirist. That's my goal as a writer, is to discover how to hold those two ways of thinking about ancestors together. And the last thing is, I knew that for some people in my family, some folks in my family who enjoyed some distinction in their lives, there are plenty of people who are going to tell the glorious stories about them. You didn't need me to come in and do that. What could I contribute to that would be distinct and worthwhile for readers? And I think it is the more human, the more flawed, the more textured story. And I leave it to other biographers and encyclopedia authors and essayists and more to tell other versions of their stories. Those are true stories too. They're just not the one I'm best equipped to tell.
I would love to know some of the emotional personal responses that you had, because I was also thinking about when I've learned about my own history. I remember learning that family coming over from Poland, that one person on the boat died, and I had to sit with that because I realized that my being here, that people did a dangerous trek and somebody didn't make it, and I'm the result of some it really hit me. And then I had an emotional response to it that I didn't realize I would have. Somebody I'd never met, right? And in that history, and it just, but at any rate, and then the other day, my daughter's been asking about my family history and things like that. She wanted to see a picture of my grandmother, and I was digging through this old box of photos, and I came across a picture of my grandmother that I had never seen before, and it was a younger photo of her. When I picked it up, I saw it, and I just said, oh my God. And this just happened the other day. I just started crying, and my poor daughter was like, what's wrong, Mama? What's wrong? And I said, no, I'm happy. I resemble this grandmother so much. And to see a younger photo of her and to see my face, her face, my face, it meant so much. It was like a relief. It was a connection, and it was a moment of joy. And my daughter didn't understand why I was crying. But I would love to know, in your research, if you had moments of joy or relief when you learned something very personal about somebody that you were blood related to. What was that like, or what was that moment?
That's such a great question. If I could say that, I love it very much. There's a part late in the book where my own grandmother is being interviewed for an oral history. She is by then in her 80s. The Schlesinger Library, which is the women's history library at Harvard, has organized, or a group of Black women historians there have organized an oral history project. And my grandmother is one of the subjects. So I've read that interview many times. I've listened to it. But what always moves me is the moment in which the interviewer, looking at photographs of me and my siblings, and this goes back to Konstantin's point, me and my siblings, and says to my grandmother, what are they? What are they? I listen to and I read my grandmother, I think, defending us, right? Defending, refusing to answer the question, right? Reducing to invent a box for us, insisting on our humanity in a sense, and tussling with this very experienced interviewer who happens also to be a very distinguished historian. That to me is very personal, because I think that another person might have slapped a label on us and might have called us mulattoes. I don't know. It's like it's the 1970s. That seems like an old school term, but there isn't really much of a language. But what I really appreciate is my grandmother, who just was not going to participate in or fuel a researcher who was looking for some new sort of box into which we as her grandchildren would fit. And she basically tells the researchers, we're not going to talk about that. Not in that way. I never saw her defend us in front of me. That's not the way the world works, right? Those kind of scenes are off. We're not in the room at all. And so the oral history is really precious in that sense, because it taught me something about how the way in which she loved us and the fierceness with which she loved us just as we were, even if we didn't make sense to other people. I love that moment a lot.
That's amazing. Reminds of the several several moments throughout your story, or those subtle acts of heroism, really, in those moments that make up kind of the totality of the experience that really, really was cathartic for me in reading. That just having that richness of your family and all the depth of their being and the good and the bad, it really made you just those characters you can really identify and really brought you into the story and really helped to go along this journey with you and see the similarities of my own journey as an African American. I can imagine, even like as you mentioned, the broader journeys of other Americans that have been, people are trying to put them in this one box, but they're, that kind of fight to be like, embrace all the totality of who they are.
Yeah.
It reminded me of thinking about my own complicated family, where, coming up as, coming of age in the late 80s, 90s with the, Public Enemy and, Fight the Power, kind of this militancy, thinking about reflecting on my grandmother who proud Black woman from the South, moved to the North, business owner and very fair skinned. And the same token, as a young kid, we couldn't be out in the sun too long. We had to, put maybe a clothespin on our nose to keep the nose thin, and how I would never tell anyone, talk about those types of things outside of my family because of, right at that age, those are things like, oh my God, I can't believe she did that, and how I might have looked at that. As much as I loved and admired and put her on the pedestal, that's part of her story that I would never want to tell. And I love how you told the empowering part, but you also told the other piece. But it was the reality of our situation when we had to live through.
So I think you probably understand as well as anybody could how difficult it was to put on the page some of my own grandmother's colorism, because then and still now, I think this is, one of the most pernicious, enduring facets of the trouble of color
Right.
for us even today. But I hope that I believe that she does understand my purpose in telling that story, because it's a reminder of the things about what persists until our time, right? The colorism of our own time is not an invention of the 21st century. It's an old story among and between us on the one hand. In her case, it's not the only story, because for all of the ways in which she subscribed to a kind of colorism, she was the daughter of a woman who could pass while she could not. And so she knew colorism, if you will, from the other side as well. That was also part of her story. As I said, I had to know that I loved her enough, or I could love her in a way that meant I could take an honest, frank look at who she was and how she lived and still honor her in my heart and in my practice every day. And I'd like to think as a family, we're better for it. I don't want to speak for my siblings or my cousins. That would be presumptuous. But I think that we all understand that part of her story and honor her still. We understand that it was an essential part of the story that needed in its own way to be told. Right?
And I really agree. And from someone outside reading it, and to me, the way that you told the story and really the entirety of the book, it really grants grace. This is the world that we live in. And in some ways, and I really love the point that you made earlier, that in some ways passing was a political protest.
Yeah.
And in its own way. And so oftentimes we look at it from our perspective of where we sit now. But in those moments, in those times, we really have to grant grace because of the absolute terror in which, that they were living in. And so to me, it was part of telling our whole story, but also in a way that grants grace for some things that we may look back in our seat now and look back on and say, well, that doesn't reflect well. But in reality, we have to give grace for their context and the way and what they experienced, the world that they lived in, which is an entirely different world than we live in now.
Yeah, and this is not a book that's about like setting the ancestors straight or correcting the record, and it's certainly not a book about retribution or rebuke. That's not the kind of book I wanted to write. And it was a journey for me to discover how to tell the difficult parts of the story and not fall into the I know better and I know more and let me tell you, ancestors, how it really should have been. There are stories that are told in that voice. That's just it was not part of my aspiration for this book. I really wanted to understand them better for who they were, warts and all, rather than upbraid them somehow for who they were not.
Yeah. And and I really feel like that's what makes this book so special, is that it's the story of the journey, and it invites the readers to come along on that journey, also to reflect on their own journey and really
Mm.
see the similarities and the ups and downs and the paths, and not only see that journey, but one thing it made for me is like, I really want to know more about my family history and my
Mm.
family journey. Where can I, I'm like remiss, like, why haven't I started this already? I think that's even beyond just our, being an African American, that similarity in that journey. But I think, as Gwen mentioned, most Americans are immigrants, and we weren't born here, right? And
Yeah.
so to think about all of our journeys and how we came into some of the similarities and ups and downs, but then in a sense highlighting those similarities, I think that that's something that can be healing in many ways. And I think your story helps bring that together and can bring others kind of to a place of deeper understanding of all the different rich perspectives that make up the country.
Yeah. Something I was thinking about, and this is my existentialism background, is that the question that kept coming up in my head as I was reading your book is, what does it mean to be Black in America? That was the question that kept
Mhm.
coming up. And if you're like me, of Eastern European descent or Western European descent, we're afforded as white this huge range of history and cultural backgrounds and different languages. But to be Black in America, it is a rather narrow definition. And what your book is doing is it is highlighting, well, wait a minute, what does it mean to be Black in America? Because it's not just a genetic component, it is the way in which the world perceives you.
Yeah, I think that, if there's a commentary, and this is not a book of commentary or analysis, but if there's a gentle commentary, right, it is about expanding and continuing to grow our sense of what Blackness is, who is Black in America and what that means. And to, in my sense, to embrace that kind of roiling, complicated, confounding notion of Blackness, sort of to embrace all of that rather than to police that or to draw narrow boxes. And in that sense, mine is only one family story, and there are many family stories as there are Black Americans and more. But it is in part a plea that we continue to embrace all of that, even as it is fraught, even as it comes out of difficult history, even as it leads to wounds and misunderstanding and more in our own time. It is still, for me, important to live with and live through that complexity rather than to deny it or to try and overly simplify it. And I know not everyone will agree with that, but I invite folks at least to come on the journey with me to see how I arrive there, and of course to arrive at their own ideas, right, about what Blackness is for them and what that is in their lived experience too.
Martha, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for your book. It was so moving, and I just am really excited to share this. I'm really excited the way that you've opened up the conversation, and it's a beautiful book. Very happy to recommend it. Thank you so much for coming on Good as in the Details.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being with me, spending this hour with me, and for the conversation. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Just appreciate it. The book is so amazing. Everyone's got to read it. No one can pick it up, and like, you won't be able to just go ahead and chalk off some blocks of time if you pick it up, because you're not going to be able to put it down. You're going to just, order food in, hold up for the weekend, because that's what's going to happen.
Wait, I gotta tell Martha, this is a true story, Martha. I gotta tell you, Konstantin and I were just on a mini holiday. I had your book with me, and during the day, he was like, do you want a drink or something? I said, no. I know we're on vacation, but I gotta read this. This is so good. I couldn't put your book down. I'm like, I didn't want to go I didn't want to go into the water. I didn't want to have a drink. I'm like, I gotta sit down because it's, I think some of your prose in the first chapter just rocked me. It was so beautiful. And so yeah, that's a true story. I postponed having a cocktail and getting in the pool because I was so sucked into reading your book.
Basically, you ruined the first part of our vacation. But
I don't know how to feel right now, if I can be
but after
honest.
reading it is still worth it. I'm okay with it because I understand.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Sallow. Remember, everyone, you can check us out on Patreon for extra content and join our book club and support the pod. Patreon.com/goodisinthedetails. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor, AvonmoreInc.com. It's that small bridge business that started in the 90s and grew to an international sensation amongst bridge players. Go to AvonmoreInc.com to get everything you need for your next bridge party. Let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Okay, remember, you can check us out on Instagram. We're also on Blue Sky and Facebook. Until next time, bye.